Story 1. There's a particular kind of silence that settles into a truck cab at 1 in the morning on an empty mountain road. A silence with texture to it, made up of tire hum and engine drone and the small creaks of a trailer settling on its axles. And I've spent 11 years learning to trust that silence the way other people trust a quiet house. The night I want to tell you about started exactly like every other night on that road, which is precisely why what happened has never fully left me, because nothing about the hours leading up to it gave me any reason to expect what came next. My name doesn't matter for this, so I'll just tell you what I do. I drive long-haul freight, mostly refrigerated loads, and I've run the same lane through West Virginia for going on 11 years. There's a stretch of Route 60 that cuts through a hollow, so narrow the sun doesn't touch the road until almost 10 in the morning. And truckers have a name for it that I won't say on camera, because saying it feels like calling something. Old-timers in the diners along that route talk about it the way you'd talk about a dangerous stretch of river, with a kind of practical respect rather than open fear, mentioning it mostly in the context of advice. Keep your windows up, keep moving, don't stop for anything short of a real emergency. Advice I always took as standard trucker caution about deer and black ice rather than anything more specific. It was late November, maybe 2 years back, cold enough that my breath fogged the windshield from the inside even with the heat cranked. I was running behind schedule and pushed through instead of pulling into the rest stop like I usually do. Somewhere around 1 in the morning, my CB started picking up chatter that didn't make sense. Not static, not cross signals. A voice low and even, reading off a list of names. My name was on that list. I heard it clear as anything, sandwiched between two names I didn't recognize, spoken in the exact rhythm someone would use calling roll. Before that night, I'd heard other drivers mention that hollow in passing, always in the same flat, careful tone people use when they've decided not to think too hard about something. Always ending the conversation with some version of, just don't stop there if you can help it. I'd nodded along at truck stops over coffee without really absorbing it, the way you nod along at any story that hasn't happened to you yet. That list of names kept going after mine. 3 more names read out in that same even cadence. And somewhere underneath the fear, I remember a colder thought surfacing. The recognition that a list only gets read out loud when somebody intends to check names off it eventually. I pulled over on the shoulder because my hands were shaking too bad to keep driving straight. That's when I saw it standing at the tree line, just past the ditch, tall in a way that didn't sit right with how a person stands. It wasn't moving, but it was facing my cab dead on, and even with my high beams cutting across it, I couldn't get a clean look at a face. There was a shape where a face should be, sure, but my eyes kept sliding off it like it didn't want to be looked at directly. The longer I stared, the more I became convinced it was somehow closer to my truck than it had been a moment before, though I never saw it take a single step to get there, the way a picture changes between blinks without you ever catching the actual movement. My engine was still running, my heater still blowing warm air across the dash, and none of that ordinary comfort did anything at all to cut through the cold creeping up through my boots. I did the only thing that felt right, which was lay on my horn until my ears rang. The thing tilted its head, slow, like it was considering whether that was worth reacting to, and then it turned and walked back into the trees on legs that bent wrong at the knee. I didn't see it run. I didn't need to. I put that truck in gear and didn't look at my mirrors again until I hit the next town's lights. Even once I was sitting in that lit lot with a cup of gas station coffee going cold in the cup holder, I kept catching myself glancing at the door lock, even though I knew perfectly well it was already down. Some animal part of my brain refusing to accept the danger had actually ended just because the visible threat was 2 counties behind me now. I called my wife from that lot, even though it was well past midnight her time, mostly just to hear her actual voice, the real texture of it, to compare against whatever version of it might come across a CB radio someday. And she picked up groggy and confused and asked if everything was all right. And I told her yes, everything was fine, because There wasn't any way to explain what I actually needed from that call without sounding like I'd lost my mind somewhere out on that road. I keep a small notebook in my cab now, something I never used to bother with, where I log the mile marker and time whenever anything even slightly unusual happens on that stretch. A habit I picked up after that night, mostly because writing it down in the moment makes it feel less like something my own mind invented after the fact. Looking back through those entries recently, I noticed something I hadn't put together before. That every single unusual entry, 5 of them now over 2 years, falls within 11 days of a new moon. A pattern I have absolutely no explanation for and have decided not to think about too hard, except that I've started timing my runs through that hollow when I can, to avoid those windows entirely. Other drivers I've mentioned this to since have their own versions, never identical, but close enough in shape that I no longer think any of us are imagining things. One woman who runs the same general route told me she'd heard her late father's voice come through her CB once, reciting an old fishing story he used to tell, word for word, years after he'd passed, somewhere on that same stretch. She said she pulled over and cried before she even felt scared, and it was only afterward, replaying it, that the wrongness of it caught up to her. We don't talk about it at the truck stops where other drivers might overhear. We talk about it quietly, in cabs, engine running, windows up, like we're the only ones who'd understand. What I haven't told many people, including most of the other drivers who've compared notes with me about that hollow, is that when I finally pulled into a lit lot almost 40 minutes later and sat there with the engine running and my hands still shaking, I checked my logbook out of habit, the way you do at the end of any long stretch, and found that I'd apparently been parked on that shoulder for closer to 25 minutes, rather than the 4 or 5 it had felt like in the moment. A gap in my own memory of that night that I have never been able to account for and have mostly stopped trying to. I told my dispatcher the following week that I wanted a different lane, and when he asked why, in that tired way dispatchers ask when they already suspect the answer isn't going to be something they can log in a system, I just told him I'd had a bad night and left it at that. He didn't push. He mentioned almost offhand that he'd had 2 other drivers request the same reroute over the years without ever fully explaining why, and that the company kept that particular lane in rotation mostly because nobody higher up wanted to admit there was a pattern worth acknowledging. That was almost worse than if he'd laughed it off, because it meant somewhere in a filing cabinet there's a quiet little record of drivers like me who came back from that hollow different, and nobody's ever done anything with it beyond noting it down. I still run that lane because the company won't reroute me and I've got a mortgage same as anybody. But I keep a handheld scanner on now instead of the CB, and if I ever hear a voice start reading names again, I'm pulling into the nearest lit parking lot and staying there till sunup. Load be damned. If driving through the dark for a living sounds like something you'd never do after hearing that, imagine doing it every night without knowing which stretch of road is the bad one. Smash that like button if this one got under your skin, and tell us in the comments if truckers where you're from have their own version of that hollow. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one, because it only gets worse from here. Story 2. There's a particular quality to the dark in the furthest hollows of eastern Kentucky. A dark that seems to start earlier and press closer than it does anywhere else I've worked. And after 20 years of driving into it alone at all hours, I've learned which kinds of quiet are ordinary and which kinds mean something is different that night. What happened at one house in particular has stayed lodged in me in a way none of my other deliveries ever has. Not because of anything that went wrong with the birth itself, but because of everything that happened just outside the door while I waited for it. I've been a home birth midwife in eastern Kentucky for almost 20 years, which means I've spent more nights driving mountain roads at 3 in the morning than most people spend driving anywhere at all. You learn the roads. You learn which houses have dogs that'll come at your car and which ones don't. You learn eventually which parts of a holler feel different after dark, and you stop asking why. Midwifery out here is as much about earning trust as it is about medical skill. since a lot of these families have been managing their own births for generations with only occasional outside help. And the ones who do call me in tend to be the ones who've decided, for whatever private reason, that this particular birth needs an extra set of trained hands. That family had called me in for every single one of their children over 15 years. Always cordial, always grateful, and always careful. In that particular unhurried way, mountain families sometimes are about which parts of their lives they let an outsider see. There's a family I used to deliver for, out past a hollow so far back that cell service dies half a mile before their gate. Good people, quiet, been on that land since before anybody could remember. The grandmother, before she passed, made a point of telling me one thing every single visit. Never answer if you hear a baby crying outside after dark, no matter how real it sounds, because their babies don't cry out there. They've made sure of that a long time ago. She said it the same way every visit, word for word almost, sitting in her rocking chair by the wood stove while I set up my kit. And there was never a hint of storytelling performance in it. No dramatic pause, no glance to see if I was properly frightened. She said it the way you'd remind a visitor to wipe their boots, a small practical piece of household information passed along out of courtesy rather than for effect, which somehow made it land harder than if she'd made a production of it. I filed it away with a dozen other pieces of mountain folklore families had shared with me over the years, respectful of it without ever really believing I'd need to act on it myself. I thought it was just old mountain talk until the night I delivered their youngest granddaughter. It was a hard labor, went past midnight, and by the time I stepped out to get supplies from my car, the whole holler had gone dead quiet in that way that makes your ears ring. And then I heard it, a baby crying, thin and choked, coming from somewhere off past the tree line behind their barn. My first instinct, the instinct any woman in my line of work has trained into her bones, was to go toward that sound. I had one foot off the porch step when the grandfather's hand closed around my arm so hard it left a bruise I still have a faint mark from. He didn't say a word. He just shook his head and pulled me back inside and shut the door, and we stood in that kitchen listening to something cry like an infant for almost 20 minutes straight, getting closer to the house with every pass, circling, never quite reaching the porch. There was a moment, maybe the 8th or 9th time it passed near the kitchen window, when the crying seemed to catch itself mid-sound and shift, just for a second, into something closer to laughter, low and satisfied, before dropping right back into that same choked infant wail, as if it had never happened at all, and I have never in my life wanted so badly to unhear something. At one point during those 20 minutes, the crying dropped to almost nothing, a thin whimper right at the edge of hearing, and then rose again suddenly from a spot that had to be directly beneath the kitchen window, close enough that I swear I felt the floorboards carry some faint vibration with it, though the grandfather never once looked toward that window, kept his eyes fixed on the door instead, like the window wasn't the part that mattered. It stopped right around the time the real baby started crying inside, like it had been listening for that, and lost interest when it had heard the genuine thing. Nobody in that house has ever explained it to me beyond what the grandmother already said. And I've stopped asking because some families keep their arrangements private, and I respect that. In the years since, I've quietly started asking other longtime families in similarly remote hollows whether they keep any rule resembling that one, framing it carefully as professional curiosity about regional traditions surrounding childbirth. And I've been surprised at how many times I get a long pause followed by a careful general answer rather than outright denial. One grandmother in a different county told me only that her family keeps its babies indoors after dark until they're old enough to walk on their own. No explanation offered beyond that, delivered with the exact same unbothered practicality the first grandmother had used. Another family simply changed the subject entirely, which somehow told me more than an answer would have. I've started to believe these arrangements aren't isolated to any one family or hollow, but rather represent some older shared understanding, that different communities arrived at independently, or perhaps inherited from a common source. So far back, nobody alive remembers where it started, each family maintaining its own version of the same basic caution, passed down as practical instruction rather than folklore, and each family assuming understandably that their situation is unique to them rather than part of something far more widespread across these mountains than any of us fully realizes. The granddaughter I delivered that night is a healthy, happy child now. And every so often the family sends me photographs marking her birthdays, and I keep every single one pinned to a small board in my office. A quiet, private reminder of the good that this work still produces, even on the nights it costs me something to provide it. I still think about that thin whimper at the edge of hearing more than I'd like to, especially on nights when I'm driving alone back from a delivery in a hollow I don't know as well. And I've started carrying a small battery lantern in my car for no reason I can fully articulate, except that it feels better to have some light of my own choosing available if I ever need it. I still deliver for people way back in those hollers. I just don't step outside after dark anymore, no matter what I hear, no matter how much it sounds like it needs help. In the weeks afterward, I found myself thinking back over every visit I'd made to that house across the years, replaying small details that had never registered as significant at the time. The way the grandmother always kept a bowl of something set out on the back porch rail that nobody ever explained. The way the family's dog, otherwise a friendly and unremarkable hound, would refuse point blank to go past the tree line no matter how far a ball was thrown in that direction. None of it had struck me as strange in isolation. Together, it painted a picture of a family that had spent generations quietly managing something the rest of us never had to think about, and I found myself grateful, in a complicated way, that they'd trusted me enough to warn me at all rather than simply letting me learn it the hard way. I've come to think that whatever those families are quietly managing operates on some kind of exchange, though none of them have ever used that word with me directly. Small offerings and small avoidances trading for a kind of uneasy peace that's held for generations without anyone needing to fully articulate the terms. It's not so different when I think about it from a lot of unspoken agreements people make with dangerous things in their lives. Except most of those agreements don't involve standing on a porch at midnight, listening to something cry like a baby that isn't there. That family knew something the rest of us don't, and they've survived out there for generations because of it. If stories about the things people quietly learn to live alongside in these mountains interest you, make sure you like this video so we know to keep digging up more like it. Comment if your own family has a rule nobody talks about outside the house. And subscribe because Story 3 is about to explain exactly why that grandmother's rule existed in the first place. Story 3. Anyone who's spent real time alone on a mountainside with a saw in their hands knows there's a specific rhythm to that kind of solitude. The engine noise filling up all the empty space so completely that the moment you shut it off, the sudden quiet feels almost physical, like a hand pressed flat against your chest. I've worked plenty of isolated tracks over the years without a second thought, and I want to be clear that I'm not a man who spooks easily. What happened on one particular job 3 Octobers ago is the reason I no longer take contracts sight unseen, no matter what they're offering to pay. I run a small engine and chainsaw repair shop out of my garage in Southwest Virginia, and every fall I do side work clearing deadfall for a logging outfit that takes contracts on private timber tracts. It's good money and I'm good at it, and until 3 Octobers ago, I never thought twice about spending a full day alone on a mountainside, with nothing but a saw and a radio. Timber contracts like that one come through word of mouth mostly, foremen calling around to whoever's available and reliable, and I'd built enough of a reputation over the years that I rarely asked many questions before accepting a job, trusting that if the pay was fair and the work was straightforward, the rest would sort itself out. That trust had never once let me down before that particular October, which is probably exactly why the warning signs on that tract didn't register with me the way they should have. We'd been given a tract that the landowner hadn't logged in almost 40 years, way up past where any of the marked trails go. And the outfit's foreman told me flat out before I had even started that the previous crew had walked off the job halfway through and refused to come back. No explanation given, forfeited their pay and everything. I figured they'd run into a bear or gotten spooked by nothing, so I didn't think much of it. Second day up there, I found trees marked. Not by any forestry service, not with paint or tags, but with deep gouges cut into the bark at exactly head height, spaced out along what looked like a deliberate path through the tract. Like something had walked a route through those woods over and over across many years, and left a mark each time to remember the way. The gouges were too high for any animal I know of to reach standing on four legs, and too wide and deep for anything with claws that size to move quiet, which whatever made them clearly did, because I never heard a single footstep the whole time I was up there. The gouges bothered me more the longer I looked at them because they weren't random. They were spaced with an evenness that took real intention, roughly every 80 yards or so as best I could pace it out. And each one was cut at a slightly different angle, like whatever made them had reached out without turning its whole body, swiping and passing rather than stopping to work at the bark. I found myself counting them without meaning to, the way you count telephone poles on a long drive, and somewhere around the 9th or 10th one I realized I'd been quietly hoping I wouldn't find an 11th, because 11 meant it had been a while since anything had walked that path recently enough to still smell like sap. I kept working because I needed the money, but by mid-afternoon I started feeling it before I saw anything. That specific prickle on the back of your neck that means you're being watched from a fixed point rather than just glanced at in passing. When I finally looked up from my saw, there was something standing between two trees about 60 yards off, tall as the lower branches around it, pale in a way that didn't match tree bark or rock or anything else up there. And it wasn't moving at all, not swaying, not breathing that I could see, just standing there, facing me straight on. I shut my saw off and it still didn't move. And I stood there in that ringing silence for what felt like 5 minutes, but was probably 30 seconds. In that silence, I noticed the birds had gone quiet too. Not gradually the way they do when the light starts changing toward evening, but all at once, like someone had thrown a switch. And the only sound left on that whole mountainside was my own breathing and the tick of my saw's engine cooling down. Somewhere in that stretch of stillness, I became aware that the pale shape between the trees had shifted its weight, subtle but unmistakable, like a man adjusting his stance before a long conversation. And I understood with total certainty that it was in no hurry at all, that whatever came next was going to happen entirely on its own schedule rather than mine. I picked up my gear without breaking eye contact and walked backward down the mountain the entire way to my truck, never once turning around, feeling with each step like I was leaving a debt unpaid rather than simply finishing a workday. I called the foreman from the truck and told him I was done with that tract, and when I mentioned the marked trees, he went real quiet and said the last crew had described the exact same thing before they quit, gouges and all, and that the landowner had specifically told him not to mention it to whoever took the job, because nobody would take it otherwise. What he told me next stuck with me longer than anything I'd actually seen up on that mountain, that the landowner's family had owned that tract for 5 generations, and had never once, in all that time, sold the timber rights to anyone willing to actually go through with clearing it, always finding some excuse to let the contract lapse once a crew got a look at what was up there, and that the current owner had only pushed forward with this particular job because he was drowning in debt and needed the money worse than he needed to keep respecting whatever his grandfather had always avoided disturbing. I found out later, through a cousin who works county records, that the tract had been quietly taken off the market again within the month, the sale falling through under circumstances nobody in the family would discuss, and that as far as I know it still sits untouched to this day, the marked trees presumably still standing exactly where I left them, still being tended by whatever keeps that patient, evenly spaced record of its own passing through. I've taken plenty of other logging contracts since in plenty of other isolated places, and I've made it a personal rule to always ask before accepting any job site unseen whether the same crew has worked that particular track before. And if the answer involves any hesitation at all, any pause longer than it should take to simply say yes, I turn the job down regardless of what it pays. Most contractors think I'm being overly cautious. A few, the ones who've worked these mountains longest, just nod slowly and don't ask me to explain further, which tells me more than any explanation ever could. I asked around town afterward, cautiously, the way you do when you don't want to sound like you've lost your mind, and found an older logger who'd worked that same general area decades before, under a different outfit entirely. He didn't need much prompting once I mentioned the gouges in the bark, just nodded slowly, and told me his crew had found the same thing on a different tract nearly 30 years earlier, high up on a ridge 2 mountains over. And that 2 men on that crew had quit logging altogether within the year, one of them leaving the trade for good despite it being the only work he'd ever known. He said something that's stuck with me since, that the marks weren't a warning so much as a record, like a hunter notching a tally somewhere private, and that whatever kept that tally had been doing it for a lot longer than any of us had been alive to notice. Sometimes on slow evenings I find myself wondering how many other tracks across these mountains carry the same quiet reputation, passed down family to family, contract to contract, without ever once making it into any official record a stranger could stumble across. It's a strange kind of knowledge to hold, knowing there are places on a map that everyone local avoids for reasons nobody writes down, while outsiders keep pricing timber they'll never actually get to cut. I don't go up that mountain anymore for any amount of money. If you've ever taken a job that seemed too easy for the pay, and later understood why nobody else wanted it, you already know that feeling in your gut before you even see anything. Like this one, if that hit close, drop a comment about the worst job site you've ever worked, and subscribe because we've got 12 more of these lined up tonight. Story 4, bees don't lie, and after 15 years of keeping them, I've come to trust their collective judgment more than I trust most instruments I could buy. When 90,000 individual insects across dozens of colonies all start behaving the same unusual way at once, something in the world around them has shifted, and it's foolish not to pay attention. What happened at one particular apiary site taught me that lesson more thoroughly than I ever wanted to learn it. I keep bees for a living, about 90 hives spread across 4 different properties in the Blue Ridge, and I do most of my hive checks alone because my husband works a regular job and the bees don't wait for weekends. There's one apiary site, a field a widow lets me use rent-free in exchange for honey, that backs up against a stretch of old-growth forest nobody's touched in over 100 years. Because it sits on a boundary dispute nobody's bothered settling. That widow has lived alone on that property for going on 30 years since her husband passed, and she's always been kind to me in a plain-spoken way, never asking much about the bees beyond how the honey's coming along. Though she did mention once, almost in passing, that her husband had always kept a large dog, specifically for that backfield, and had never let it wander alone anywhere near those woods, even in broad daylight, a detail I hadn't thought much of until much later. Bees are honest animals. They tell you things about their environment that you can't always see yourself. And my hives at that particular site had started acting wrong about 2 weeks before anything happened to me directly. Agitated for no reason I could find, clustering tighter than they should for the weather. And one morning I found every single hive entrance facing away from the tree line, which bees don't do on their own. Not across 90 colonies at 4 different sites, only at that one. Beekeepers talk to each other more than people realize, sharing notes across county lines about weather and forage and disease. And when I mentioned the entrance behavior to a few colleagues at a regional meeting, 2 of them went quiet in a way that told me they recognized it, though neither would say much beyond agreeing that bees know things well before people do and that it's usually worth listening to them. That conversation sat with me for days afterward, a low hum of worry underneath my normal routine, the kind of feeling you can't quite justify to your husband over dinner because nothing concrete has actually happened yet. I went out to check them at dusk one evening because I'd had a delivery run late and wanted to make sure a hive wasn't queenless before dark. While I was working, I heard what I can only describe as breathing, slow and enormous, coming from somewhere in the tree line, maybe 40 yards off, deep enough that I felt it more than heard it, like standing near industrial machinery. I froze with my hive tool still in my hand and watched a section of the woods, a section wide enough that no single animal should be able to account for it, sway and part like something massive was moving through brush that shouldn't have given way that easily. Whatever it was never fully stepped into the field. It stayed in the tree line the whole time, but I caught glimpses through gaps in the branches, patches of something dark and matted that moved with a rhythm too smooth and too slow to be any bear or elk. And every hive around me went into what beekeepers call a roar, that specific defensive hum thousands of bees make together when they sense a threat they can't individually fight. I've heard that roar maybe 5 times in 15 years of keeping bees, always for something specific, a bear usually. And this was louder and longer than any of those times combined. The breathing kept pace with me the entire walk back to my truck, staying at that same 40-yard distance behind the tree line, no matter how quickly or slowly I moved. And twice I heard a low branch bend and release, with a weight behind it that no bird or raccoon could account for, close enough that I caught myself counting my own steps just to have something steady to hold on to. At one point, right as I reached my truck door, the breathing paused entirely for 3 or 4 full seconds. A held breath so complete, it felt deliberate, almost considerate, like something pausing out of a strange courtesy, before resuming its slow, rhythmic pull of air the moment my door was shut and locked. I left my equipment behind and walked to my truck without running, because I've read enough to know running triggers something in predators, real or otherwise, and I drove home and didn't go back to check those hives for 4 days. My husband noticed something was wrong the moment I walked in that evening, since I've never once in our marriage abandoned a piece of beekeeping equipment in the field. And when I finally told him what had happened, haltingly, expecting him to gently suggest I'd imagined it after a long, tiring day, he instead went and got his grandfather's old shotgun down from the closet and set it by the door without a word, which told me he believed me more completely than any reassurance could have. When I finally did return to that apiary 4 days later, driving out in full daylight with my husband following in his own truck just in case, every hive was exactly as I'd left it, healthy, undisturbed, humming along in that ordinary daytime way that made the whole episode feel almost impossible to have actually happened. It was only once I got close enough to check the entrances themselves that the ordinary feeling cracked, because every single one, all 90 colonies across that site, had reoriented to face away from those woods, a uniform shift that no natural cause I know of could produce across that many separate colonies at once. And they've stayed that way ever since, no matter how many times I turn the boxes back around myself. I mentioned the roar to a beekeeping mentor of mine, a woman who's kept hives in that same county for over 50 years. And rather than dismiss it, she got very quiet and asked me exactly where the apiary sat relative to the tree line. And when I described it, she told me without much hesitation that her own grandfather had kept hives on a nearby ridge decades earlier and had eventually moved every single colony off that land. After a summer where the bees roared almost nightly for 2 straight weeks, refusing to explain further beyond saying, some ground simply isn't meant to be worked past a certain hour, bees or no bees. She didn't seem surprised by my story at all, which unsettled me more than if she had been. I still work that apiary because moving 90 hives isn't something you do lightly, financially, or physically. And because the widow who owns the land has become a genuine friend over the years. And I don't want to abandon our arrangement without a better reason than a feeling, however strong that feeling was. But I've started keeping a portable radio with me now, tuned to a local country station, on the theory that ordinary human music playing nearby might make that field feel less isolated less like the kind of quiet place something patient would choose to watch from. I have no evidence it actually helps. It helps me, at least, and some days that's reason enough. The widow still lets me keep bees there. I just don't go alone anymore, and I never go after 4 in the afternoon, regardless of the season. There's a particular kind of trust required to keep animals in a place where they clearly sense something you can't. A willingness to let their instincts override your own comfort, even when you can't point to a single concrete thing wrong. I've built my whole livelihood on trusting bees more than my own eyes, and that afternoon taught me exactly how far that trust needs to extend when the ground itself starts feeling different. There's something about an animal's fear being more convincing than your own eyes that sticks with you longer than seeing a thing yourself would. If you've ever trusted an animal's instincts over your own senses, let us know in the comments, and hit like if you'd have run the second you heard that breathing. Subscribe now because Story 5 takes us underground, and it's one of the ones our team argued about posting at all. Story 5. Half a mile under a mountain, the dark has a weight to it that no surface darkness can match. A pressure that sits on your chest, even with a good headlamp cutting a clean beam in front of you. I've spent the better part of 15 years comfortable in that weight. Comfortable enough that I stopped thinking of it as unusual work a long time ago. There is exactly one job in all those years that changed how comfortable I am willing to be. And it happened in a section of an old coal mine that I will never enter again without another person beside me. I've worked as an electrician doing maintenance contracts in active and abandoned coal operations across southern West Virginia for almost 15 years. And most of that work is about as unglamorous as it sounds. Wiring pump systems, checking ventilation fans, replacing lighting in sections that still get occasional foot traffic, even though the coal ran out decades ago. You get used to being underground alone for long stretches, and you get used to the particular kind of quiet that exists half a mile under a mountain, which isn't silence so much as an absence that presses on your ears. Contract electricians in this line of work develop a specific relationship with the mines we service, closer to caretaking than construction. Since most of what we do is simply keeping old infrastructure functional rather than building anything new, that closeness breeds a certain comfort with the environment that outsiders never quite understand. A comfort I'd built up over a decade and a half before that one contract quietly took a chunk of it away from me for good. Old-timers I've worked alongside over the years have their own private vocabulary for the mine. Terms passed down from crews who worked underground back when a canary in a cage was standard equipment rather than a figure of speech. And more than a few of them have mentioned in passing, usually over a smoke break topside, that certain sealed sections have a reputation that has nothing to do with gas or structural risk. The kind of reputation that gets handled with silence and avoidance rather than warning signs. I'd always taken that as old mine talk, the same category as sailors not whistling on a ship, until my own contract put me directly into one of those sections. About 4 years ago, I was contracted to check a ventilation fan motor in a section of an old drift mine that had been sealed off from the active parts, but was still accessible through a maintenance tunnel for equipment purposes. I'd been in that section maybe a dozen times before without incident. This time, about 20 minutes into the job, my radio picked up what sounded like someone tapping on metal. 3 taps, a pause, 3 taps again, coming from somewhere deeper in the sealed section where nobody had any business being and where nobody besides me was scheduled to be that day. Miners have old superstitions about tapping underground and about things that mimic the sounds crews use to make signaling each other before radios. And even though I'm not a superstitious man by nature, something about hearing that pattern alone in a dead mine made every hair on my arm stand up. I called out because my first assumption was another contractor had wandered in without telling dispatch, and the tapping stopped immediately. Dead silence for almost a full minute. And then it started again, closer, from a direction that didn't make sense given the tunnel's layout, like it had moved through solid rock to get there. I finished tightening the last connection on that motor faster than I've ever done any job in my life. My headlamp beam kept catching shapes at the edge of the tunnel that resolved into nothing but rock and old timber the moment I focused on them directly. And twice I had the distinct sensation of air moving past my face the way it does when something large passes close by without touching you, though the ventilation in that section had been dead for years and shouldn't have produced any draft at all. As I was packing my tools, I heard, very clearly, my own name called out from somewhere behind me in the tunnel in a voice that had the general shape of my wife's voice, but none of the specific texture of it. Wrong in a way I can't fully explain, except to say it was like hearing someone do an impression of her from a recording with the details smoothed out. It said my name a second time, closer now, with a small rising warmth to it, exactly like she uses when she's teasing me about something. And that specific detail, the accuracy of that small human touch layered over something so fundamentally wrong, is what finally broke through whatever calm I'd been holding on to. My wife has never once been anywhere near that mine. There was no earthly reason for her voice to be underground calling my name. I didn't run because running in a mine with uneven footing and low clearance is how people actually die down there. But I moved with a purpose I've never matched before or since, and I did not look behind me once until I was back at the surface with sunlight on my face. The moment I stepped out into that daylight, I called my wife from the parking lot, hands still trembling too badly to properly grip the phone, and when she answered, ordinary and unbothered and clearly not anywhere near a mine shaft. I didn't tell her why I'd called, just asked her to keep talking about her day for a few minutes. And she did, confused but obliging, and something in the mundane specificity of her actual voice, the small complaints about her own workday, finally let my heart rate come back down to something normal. I reported the incident to my foreman, who didn't laugh at me the way I expected. He told me that section had a reputation going back to before the mine even closed, that 2 miners had gone missing there in the 60s, whose bodies were never recovered despite the tunnel being a dead end with no other way out, and that company policy since then had quietly been to send crews in pairs whenever possible, though nobody ever explained that policy to new contractors up front. A few weeks after that job, curiosity got the better of me, and I pulled old newspaper archives from the local library, trying to confirm what my foreman had told me about the 2 miners lost in the 60s. I found a brief article, barely 4 column inches, reporting the disappearance and noting that search crews had abandoned efforts after a week without any explanation for how 2 men could vanish entirely from a sealed tunnel with only one way in and out. There was no follow-up article that I could find, no resolution ever printed, just that single small notice and then nothing, as if the story itself had been quietly allowed to go cold the same way the case had. I still take contracts in old mines because it pays well and I know the work, but I do not go into that particular section alone anymore for any amount of money. And if my radio ever picks up tapping again, I intend to be topside before it finishes its second round. I've since made a habit of requesting a second contractor accompany me on any job in a sealed or long-abandoned section, quietly citing safety protocol rather than the actual reason. And every company I've worked for since has accommodated that request without much pushback, which tells me I'm probably not the first electrician to make it. My wife still doesn't know the full story of that night, only that I had a bad scare underground and prefer not to talk about it. And I've decided that's one piece of honesty I'm comfortable withholding from her for both our sakes. If underground spaces get to you the way they get to me, you are not alone. And I'd bet a good number of you reading this have already stopped breathing normal somewhere in that last paragraph. Every trade that puts people underground alone eventually develops its own quiet folklore, and I used to think of it as nothing more than a way for tired men to entertain themselves on long shifts. I don't think that anymore. I think some of it is a warning system, built out of necessity, passed down because writing it into an official safety manual would get everyone laughed out of the industry. So instead, it survives the only way it can, mouth to mouth, over smoke breaks, exactly the way it reached me. Now is a good time to pause and ask you directly for something. This channel only grows because people like you take 30 seconds to like the video, drop a comment, and hit subscribe. And every single one of those actions helps us keep finding and sharing accounts like this one. If you're still with us 5 stories in, you clearly want more. So go ahead and like this video right now before you keep reading. And tell us in the comments which story so far has been the worst one for you. We've got 10 more waiting, and they get harder to shake off from here. Story 6. Kids know things before adults let themselves know them, and after 9 years of driving a school bus through the same hollows every morning, I've come to trust a bus full of suddenly quiet children more than I trust most adult accounts of strange happenings. There's one stop on my route, or rather one stop that used to be on my route, that taught me exactly how right that instinct can be. I drive a school bus route through a rural district in eastern Tennessee, mostly back roads that wind through hollows, so tight the bus barely clears the trees on either side. And I've done this job for going on 9 years because I like the kids and I like the quiet of an early morning route before the sun's fully up. My route includes one stop way out past where the paved road ends, for 2 kids whose family lives at the very back of a hollow that locals call by a name that translates roughly to the hollow that watches, though nobody around here says that out loud to strangers. Bus drivers in a district as rural end up knowing entire families across years of daily stops, watching kids grow up in the rearview mirror one grade at a time, and that particular family had always struck me as a little more private than most. Friendly enough at the stop, but never inclined to chat the way some parents do while waiting for the bus. Always glancing toward those woods in a way I registered without really thinking much about at the time. For the first several years, that stop was completely ordinary. I'd pull up, the kids would climb on. We'd go about our day. About 3 years ago, without any warning or explanation, both kids stopped riding the bus, and when I asked the district office about it, they said the family had requested to be taken off the route and hadn't given a reason, which was unusual enough that I remembered it clearly. The stop itself remained on my route sheet as a scheduled stop for almost a full year afterward, due to some clerical oversight nobody caught, which meant every single school day, rain or shine, I still pulled the bus to a complete stop at that spot, opened the doors, and waited the standard 10 seconds before closing them and moving on, exactly as procedure requires, regardless of whether anyone actually boards. About 6 months into that stretch, I started noticing that the woods at that particular stop felt different from every other stop on my route. A kind of pressure in the air that made the kids near the front of the bus go quiet without me ever saying anything about it. I never asked the family directly why they'd pulled their kids off the route, mostly out of the same respect for privacy that governs most interactions out here. But I noticed small things in the months before it happened. The porch light left on well past sunrise some mornings, the mother waiting right at the edge of their yard rather than back near the house the way she used to, watching the tree line more than she watched for my bus. Little things that didn't add up to anything on their own, but that I found myself thinking about again once the stop went quiet. Then one morning in deep winter, dark enough that my headlights were still doing real work, I opened the doors at that stop as required and heard unmistakably small footsteps coming up the bus's front steps. 2 sets, quick and light, exactly like children hurrying to beat the cold, followed by the specific creak our bus seats make when weight settles into them. A creak I've heard so many thousands of times I could not mistake it for anything else. I did not turn around. I have never in my life wanted less to look in a mirror than I did in that moment. Watching my bus mirror without actually looking into it directly, catching only a blur of motion in my peripheral vision that could have been shifting shadows from my own headlights, and could have been something settling itself more comfortably into a seat behind me. The temperature in the bus seemed to drop several degrees right around the 3rd row, a cold that had nothing to do with the winter morning outside, and somewhere behind me, so quiet I almost convinced myself I'd imagined it, I heard what sounded like a small, satisfied exhale The specific sound a tired child makes settling into a seat after a long wait in the cold, and it was that ordinary, almost tender little sound more than anything else that made my hands go white-knuckled on the wheel. I closed the doors on schedule and drove the rest of my route with my hands locked on that wheel. 2 sets of small footstep sounds and seat creaks present behind me the entire way. Present right up until the moment I pulled into the school parking lot, at which point they simply were not there anymore, the way a radio station cuts to static when you drive out of range. I ran into the mother from that family by chance almost a year later at a gas station in town, and though neither of us brought up the bus route directly, something in the way she looked at me, a kind of tired recognition, told me she already knew I understood now why they'd pulled her kids off that stop. She asked, carefully, whether I still drove that road, and when I told her I did but no longer stopped there, she nodded once, said that was good, and left it at that. I've thought about that brief exchange more than almost anything else from that whole year. The way an entire understanding passed between 2 strangers without either of us saying the actual words out loud. I called the district that same day and told them to remove that stop from my sheet permanently, and I refused to explain why beyond saying I would not be stopping there again under any circumstances. And something in my voice must have carried enough weight, because they didn't argue and they didn't ask twice. A few weeks later, another driver on a different route mentioned to me, entirely unprompted over lunch in the break room, that she'd had a stop on her own route years back that she'd eventually refused to service as well. A different hollow entirely, on the far side of the county. And when we compared notes carefully, we found enough overlapping detail. The footsteps, the seat creak, the way it always stopped right at the school parking lot, that neither of us could keep pretending it was something isolated to just one road. The district eventually reassigned that route entirely to a different driver when I requested a permanent transfer to a different section of the county the following school year, and I never told my replacement anything specific, only that a couple of stops on that old route required extra caution in winter conditions, which was true enough on its own terms without needing further explanation. I think about those 2 kids sometimes, wonder how they're doing now that they'd be nearly grown. And I hope wherever they ended up going to school, their new bus route never had a stop, anything like the one their family so carefully arranged to avoid. I have driven past that hollow entrance every school day since without slowing down, and I have never once looked toward it, and I plan to keep it that way until I retire. Driving that same route every day for years teaches you a specific kind of attentiveness to the small emotional temperature of a bus full of kids. And I trust that red now more than I trust almost any other instinct I've developed on this job. Kids don't perform fear the way adults sometimes do for attention. When a whole bus goes quiet without a single word being said, something real is happening, whether or not the adults on board are willing to admit it to themselves. Kids on a bus getting quiet without anybody saying why has stuck with me more than almost anything else in this story, because kids notice things adults talk themselves out of noticing. If you've got a story about kids sensing something before adults did, we want to hear it in the comments. Like this video if that seat creak got you, and subscribe, because story 7 is about a night shift that never should have gone the way it went. Story 7. Overnight retail work teaches you to trust the ordinary rhythm of a quiet building more than almost anything else. The hum of coolers, the buzz of bad ballasts, the particular hush that settles over an empty parking lot at 2 in the morning. I've worked plenty of strange overnight shifts over the years, but only one place ever gave me a rule I still follow to this day without ever fully understanding why it works. I work overnight at a gas station and truck stop off a stretch of interstate that cuts through the mountains in North Carolina. The kind of place that's open 24 hours, mostly out of necessity, because there's nothing else for 50 miles in either direction. I took the job because the pay differential for overnight shifts is significant, and I needed the money after a divorce. And for the first year, it was exactly what you'd expect. Quiet, occasionally lonely, punctuated by truckers coming through and the rare local kid buying gas station food at 2 in the morning. That stretch of interstate has a reputation among the truckers who run it regularly, mentioned sometimes in the same breath as other notoriously isolated stretches across these mountains, though none of them ever specify exactly what they mean by it, beyond a general sense that the area deserves a certain caution. I filed that reputation away as trucker superstition for most of my first year working there, the same category as not wanting to talk about a slow shift for fear of jinxing it. There's a tree line directly behind our lot, separated only by a chain link fence and a stretch of gravel where we keep the propane exchange cage. And about 8 months into the job, I started noticing that our security cameras covering that back area would occasionally show brief distortions, not glitches exactly. More like the picture would smear for a second or two the way water smears a reflection, always around the same time each night, somewhere between 2 and 3 in the morning. Working overnight teaches you to read a store's normal rhythm, the way you'd read a familiar room in the dark. Every sound accounted for, every shadow in its expected place. And it was that same familiarity that made the smallest deviations stand out so clearly once they started. The cooler compressor cycling half a second later than usual. The bell over the door seeming to hang in the air a beat longer than it should before fading. None of it was anything I could have pointed to and called evidence. Just a slow accumulation of small wrongness that built up over weeks until I found myself avoiding the back windows entirely without consciously deciding to. I mentioned it to my manager, who told me matter-of-factly that every overnight employee in the store's history had mentioned the same thing at some point, and that he'd stopped bothering to get the cameras serviced because a technician had already confirmed the equipment itself was functioning perfectly, meaning whatever caused the distortion wasn't a hardware problem. He told me the same thing every manager apparently tells new overnight hires eventually, which is, don't go out to the propane cage alone after 2 in the morning. No matter how simple the task seems, and just let it wait until a customer needs it badly enough to complain, at which point you go out together, or not at all. I didn't fully understand why until the night I forgot that rule, because a regular customer, someone I recognized and trusted, asked for a propane exchange right around 2:30. And I didn't think twice about walking out there by myself. The gravel out back is lit by a single security light that's always buzzed with a bad ballast the whole time I've worked there. And as I was swapping tanks, that buzzing simply stopped all at once, along with every other ambient sound, crickets, distant traffic, everything. The way sound disappears right before a thunderclap, except no thunderclap came. In that silence, I became aware of a specific and distinct smell, something like wet copper mixed with turned earth, thick enough that I could taste it at the back of my throat. And my ears started ringing with a pressure like being at altitude, the kind of thing you feel right before your ears pop on a mountain drive. When I looked up from the tanks, there was something crouched on the top of the propane cage itself, folded into a space no grown person could physically fit into, limbs bent at angles that made my stomach drop just looking at them. Its head turned toward me at a tilt that kept increasing past what a neck should allow, still increasing as I stood there frozen, like it was testing how far it could go. I remember thinking in a strange, detached way that didn't feel like my own thoughts at all, that it wasn't looking at me so much as measuring me, the way you'd size up a piece of furniture before deciding whether it would fit through a doorway. I don't remember deciding to move. I remember being back inside the store with the door locked and the deadbolt thrown, watching through the glass as the security light out back flickered back on and the crickets started up again like nothing had happened. And the cage, when I finally worked up the nerve to look at the footage afterward with my manager, showed exactly what I'd described, but only for 11 seconds before the picture smeared into that familiar distortion. My hands didn't stop shaking properly until my shift ended, almost 3 hours later, and I remember pouring myself coffee twice during that stretch and forgetting both cups on the counter untouched, going cold. because I couldn't make myself sit still long enough to actually drink either one. My manager didn't say I told you so. He just nodded and said the propane cage rule stands for a reason, and left it at that. Months later, a new overnight hire started. A college kid working nights to pay for classes, and I caught myself giving him the exact same speech my manager had once given me, word for word almost, about the propane cage rule, watching his face go through the same progression of polite disbelief that mine surely had. I didn't tell him what I'd actually seen, only that the rule existed and that he should follow it without needing a reason. And I understood in that moment that I'd become one more link in a chain of overnight employees, quietly passing down a warning nobody could fully explain, but everybody eventually respected. That college kid clocked out 3 months later to transfer to a different store closer to his campus. And before he left, he pulled me aside and admitted, a little sheepishly, that around his second month he'd forgotten the rule late one night and gone out to the cage alone for a routine restock, and that nothing had happened. No distortion, no figure, nothing at all, which he'd taken at the time as proof the whole thing was overblown. It was only when I asked him what time that had been that I understood why he'd gotten lucky, because his shift that particular night had ended and started nearly 2 hours off from the window where anything has ever happened to me. A coincidence that has never once made me feel better about how close he'd come without realizing it. Overnight jobs like mine attract a specific kind of person. People who need the hours or crave the quiet or simply can't sleep on a normal schedule for reasons of their own. And there's a strange camaraderie that develops among us even across different stores in different towns. A shared understanding of what those hours can hold that daytime workers never quite grasp. I've come to believe every overnight gas station in these mountains probably has its own version of a rule like ours, quietly maintained, rarely explained, faithfully followed anyway. I still work that shift because the money's still good, and because, honestly, knowing the rule now makes me feel safer than not knowing it ever did. If you've ever had a job with an unwritten rule that turned out to be the only thing standing between you and something terrible, tell us about it below. Like this video to help us reach more people who need to hear these before they learn the hard way. And subscribe for Story 8, which happens in broad daylight, and somehow that makes it worse. Story 8. There's a particular kind of loneliness that comes with inspecting miles of isolated rail line. A job that puts you alone with your own thoughts for hours at a stretch, in places where a phone signal is more theory than fact. Most days that loneliness is simply part of the job. One stretch of track cutting through a gorge that's swallowed more than its shares of section crews over the decades taught me it can be something else entirely. I inspect a railroad track for a short line freight company that runs through some of the most isolated stretches of the Virginia and Kentucky border. Work that mostly involves walking or slow driving a rail cart along miles of track checking for damage, loose joints, anything that could derail a loaded train. It's solitary work by design, and most days the biggest excitement is finding a section of rotted tie that needs flagging for replacement. Short line inspection work like mine attracts a particular kind of person, comfortable with solitude and comfortable with repetitive attention to detail across long stretches of nothing much happening, and I'd always considered myself well suited to it, precisely because I don't spook easily, and I don't get bored the way some people would doing the same walk day after day. That gorge stretch tested both of those qualities more thoroughly than anything else in my career. There's one stretch, maybe 6 miles long, that cuts through a gorge so remote the track was laid there almost a century ago, specifically because it was the only feasible route, and nobody's ever built so much as a logging road anywhere near it since. Company records show an unusually high number of section crews requesting transfer away from that stretch over the decades, always citing vague personal reasons. And my supervisor, when I started, told me flatly to just keep my head down, do the inspection, and not linger past what the job requires. I understood what he meant on my third inspection of that gorge stretch. on a clear afternoon with good visibility. Nothing about the weather or light that should have made anything feel off. The gorge itself has a strange acoustic quality, even on an ordinary day. Sound bouncing back at odd delays off the rock walls, so that your own cart engine sometimes seems to echo from a direction you aren't facing. And I'd always chalked up the crew turnover to that alone. The kind of place that wears on a person's nerves through sheer isolation, even without anything else going on. My supervisor's warning to keep my head down had stuck with me more than I let on, and I found myself watching that far slope out of habit on every pass through, half expecting and half hoping to never actually see anything there. About halfway through, I noticed movement paralleling my cart on the far side of the gorge, on a slope too steep for any deer or bear to traverse at the pace it was keeping, matching my speed almost exactly whether I sped up or slowed down to check something. Through my binoculars, I could make out a shape that was broadly humanoid, but wrong in its proportions, arms too long relative to its torso, moving across that impossible slope on all fours, with a fluidity that didn't match the terrain at all, like gravity applied to it differently than it applies to everything else. At one point it paused on an outcropping directly across from me, motionless for several long seconds, and I had the distinct and unwelcome impression that it had turned its head, however briefly, to look directly back through my own binoculars at me, a level of mutual awareness that no wild animal has ever shown me in 12 years of this work. It never crossed the gorge toward me, and it never made a sound I could hear over my cart's engine, but it kept pace with me for nearly 2 of the 6 miles, occasionally dropping low against the slope in a crouch, before rising again to continue at the same steady gait, a rhythm to its movement that felt almost deliberately unhurried, like it wasn't trying to keep up with me so much as it simply had nowhere else it needed to be, before simply not being there anymore. When I next raised my binoculars, no sign of it having moved away, just absent. I finished my inspection because the job requires a complete pass regardless of circumstances. But I drove that cart faster than regulations technically allow for the remainder of the stretch, and I filed my report without mentioning what I'd seen because I didn't want it on record with my name attached. I asked around later carefully, framing it as idle curiosity, and found that at least 4 other current and former inspectors had independent stories about that same gorge involving something matching a similar description, always on the far slope, always keeping pace, never crossing over. One retired inspector, a man who'd worked that stretch back in the 80s, told me his crew back then had actually stopped their cart once, against every safety protocol, to try to get a longer look at it through binoculars, and that the thing had stopped moving the instant they did, turning its head to face them directly across the gorge for almost a full minute before continuing on as if nothing had happened. An experience, he said, convinced every man on that crew never to stop moving through that stretch again for any reason. Nobody had ever compared notes before because nobody wanted to be the one who brought it up first and be laughed at. And once we realized we all had the same story, none of us felt like laughing at all. One of the inspectors I spoke with, a woman who'd worked that same gorge section for almost 20 years before transferring out, told me something that has stayed with me since. That in her final year on that stretch, she'd started leaving small offerings at a specific bend in the track. Nothing elaborate, just a piece of bread or a bit of fruit set on a flat rock near the rail. A habit she'd picked up from an old section foreman without ever asking him directly why he did it himself. She said she couldn't explain why she kept doing it, except that the one time she forgot, the thing on the far slope had gotten closer to the track than it ever had before or since. I've started leaving something small at that same bend myself now, more out of respect for a tradition I don't understand than any real belief that it changes anything. And whether it's coincidence or not, I haven't seen that shape on the far slope again since I started, though I still watch that slope out of the corner of my eye on every pass through, and I suspect I always will, offering or no offering. I still inspect that stretch because someone has to, and it's my assigned section, but I do it faster than I used to, and I never bring binoculars anymore because I've decided I genuinely do not want a closer look at anything on that far slope ever again. If you've ever discovered other people had seen the exact same thing you did, but nobody spoke up first, that particular kind of validation is its own special flavor of unsettling. We want to hear about it in the comments below. Solitary jobs like mine give a person a lot of hours to think, and I've spent more of those hours than I'd like to admit turning that gorge over in my mind, trying to construct some rational explanation that would let me stop watching that far slope every single time I pass through. I've never managed it. Some places simply resist being explained away, no matter how many ordinary theories you throw at them, and eventually you just learn to coexist with the not knowing. This channel exists because of viewers who take these stories seriously enough to share them. So, if this one paralleled your nerves the way that thing paralleled the gorge, hit like right now. Subscribe before story 9 because we're only about halfway through tonight, and the next one involves a house that most of you are going to recognize the shape of immediately. Story 9. Farm families out here guard their privacy the way other people guard their bank accounts, carefully and without much explanation. And in this line of work, you learn fast that some rules exist for reasons a client will never fully spell out for you. Most of the time, those rules are harmless quirks. One family's rule turned out to be the most important instruction anyone in this profession ever gave me. I'm a large animal veterinarian working mostly with cattle and horses across a rural stretch of southern West Virginia, which means my job takes me onto isolated farms at all hours because animals don't get sick or full on convenient schedules. Farmers out here tend to be private people, and you learn early in this work to respect that privacy and not ask more questions than necessary about how a family runs their property. I've built my practice over almost a decade specifically around that discretion, understanding that these families let me onto their land and into their business in ways they wouldn't extend to just anyone. And that trust is built slowly through years of showing up reliably and keeping my questions limited to whatever the animal in front of me actually needs. That particular family had been clients since before I even opened my own practice, inherited from the older vet I trained under, who had, now that I think back on it, given me the exact same standing instruction about their gate almost word for word when he handed off their account to me. There's one farm I service, been in the same family for 5 generations, where the owner asked me the very first time I visited to always call ahead before coming, no exceptions, even for emergencies, which struck me as unusual for someone with livestock, since animal emergencies rarely give you time to plan ahead. I asked why, gently, and he told me that after dark, his family didn't open the gate for anyone who hadn't called first, no matter how urgent the situation sounded from the road, and that if I ever showed up unannounced, I should just stay in my truck at the gate and wait, not walk up, not honk, just wait. He'd explained it to me plainly enough that first visit, standing by the barn with his hat in his hands, that his family had kept that rule for as long as anyone could remember, and that it had never once failed them when they followed it properly. And something in the flatness of his delivery, the total absence of any drama in how he said it, told me this wasn't a superstition he was performing for a stranger's benefit, but a fact of life he'd simply accepted the way you accept weather. I respected his request for almost 2 years without incident, until one night his wife called in a genuine panic about a mare in difficult labor, and in my rush to help I forgot to confirm the call had actually come through their landline versus a number I didn't recognize. And by the time I reached their gate around midnight, I realized I'd never actually called ahead like he'd asked. I'd just driven straight out. Remembering his instructions at the last second, I stopped at the gate exactly as he'd told me to, and I sat there in my truck with my headlights on, waiting, engine running. The house sat maybe 200 yards up their drive, and every window was dark except for a single light in what I knew was their kitchen. Somewhere off to the side, past the barn, one of their dogs let out a single low sound, not quite a bark and not quite a whine, and then went completely silent for the rest of the time I sat there, which struck me even in the moment as unlike any dog I'd ever known. since dogs on a working farm rarely stay quiet that long once they've started fussing at something. I watched that kitchen light for probably 10 minutes before I noticed a second light, much dimmer, moving slowly across an upstairs window that I was certain didn't correspond to any room in the house, a window I'd never actually seen used or lit in 2 years of visits, moving with a smooth, deliberate pace like someone carrying a lantern down a hallway. Except the farmer had told me on an earlier visit that the entire upstairs of that house had been sealed off and unused since his grandfather's time for reasons he never elaborated on. The light paused for a long stretch directly behind the glass, and though I couldn't make out any shape holding it, I had the overwhelming sense that whatever carried it was standing perfectly still, facing the window, facing me, waiting to see whether the gate would open. The farmer himself came out to the gate on foot about 15 minutes later, having apparently gotten a ride from a neighbor rather than driving the farm truck. And when I mentioned the light moving in the sealed upstairs, he went pale in a way I've genuinely never seen on another human being before. And he told me very quietly that light only ever appears when someone reaches the gate without calling ahead first, and that I should consider myself fortunate the gate was still closed when it did. I helped deliver that mare's foal without further incident that night, and I have called ahead every single time since without fail, no exceptions. And I've never asked that family another question about their upstairs or the light I saw, because some information you're better off not having, even when it's staring you directly in a window you were told doesn't get used. I asked him once, gently, whether the light had ever actually reached anyone who ignored the rule and drove up regardless. And he went quiet for long enough that I regretted asking him before telling me only that his own uncle had done exactly that decades earlier as a younger man, testing his father's warnings, and that his uncle had lived the remainder of his life afterward, but had never spoken another clear sentence about that night, spending his final years unable to be left alone after dark, for reasons the family chose not to discuss further with outsiders. He didn't elaborate beyond that, and I didn't ask him to. I've since noticed on my regular visits that the family keeps a specific light burning in that same kitchen window every single night without fail, dusk to dawn, rain or shine, even in summer when the rest of their power usage is otherwise conservative. And I've come to understand that light isn't decorative or practical in any ordinary sense, but is instead a kind of quiet signal, a way of telling whatever waits past that gate that the household inside is accounted for and the rule is being honored. I've never asked them directly if that's the purpose. I don't need to. I still take their calls because they're good clients, and I respect their boundaries now more than ever. Working with animals for as long as I have teaches you that fear, real fear, has a specific quality to it that's hard to fake and impossible to fully hide. And I saw that quality on that farmer's face in a way I've never quite forgotten. A fear that had clearly been carried and managed for a very long time, rather than something new to him. It made me trust his instructions more completely than I trust most professional advice I've ever received, and I've never once regretted that trust since. There's something particularly unsettling about a family that has built an entire set of rules around something they've never fully explained, even to people they trust, because it tells you the danger is real enough that explaining it isn't necessary, only obeying the rule is. Let us know in the comments if you've ever followed a rule you didn't understand simply because the person giving it seemed too scared not to be taken seriously. Like this video and subscribe, because Story 10 takes us into a cave system that 3 separate spelunking groups have refused to finish mapping. Story 10. Caving demands a specific kind of trust that most hobbies never ask of you. Trust in your equipment, trust in your training, and above all, trust in the people beside you in total darkness, hundreds of feet underground. In almost 20 years of pushing into unmapped passages across these mountains, I've only once turned back from a cave system entirely, and the reason it's haunted every member of my team since. I've been an active recreational caver for almost 20 years, part of a small grotto club that maps and explores wild cave systems across the Appalachians, mostly on private land with landowner permission, documenting passages that in some cases have never been formally surveyed before. It's a hobby that requires trust in your team above almost everything else, because you are frequently hundreds of feet underground in total darkness, relying entirely on each other. Our grotto has a reputation within the broader caving community for careful, methodical work, the kind of club other cavers call when they want a passage properly documented rather than just explored for the thrill of it. And that reputation is exactly why this particular landowner reached out to us specifically, rather than a more recreational group. We took the job seriously from the start, aware that whatever previous crews had found or failed to find deserved a proper professional accounting rather than another abandoned attempt. Our club had been contracted informally by a landowner in eastern Tennessee to survey a cave system on his property that older maps showed as incomplete, with a passage marked simply as unexplored, dating back to a partial survey from the 1970s. 3 separate teams over 4 decades had apparently attempted to push past that unexplored marker, and every single one had turned back for reasons that were never clearly documented, which the landowner mentioned to us almost as an afterthought before we started, the way you'd mention a minor inconvenience rather than a warning. Our club keeps detailed logs going back decades, and in preparing for this survey, I'd pulled the original 1970s notes myself, 3 lines at most describing the unexplored passage, followed by a single handwritten annotation in the margin from whoever had typed up the report. Reading only recommend leaving as is, with no further elaboration anywhere in the file. Despite the surveyor in question being known from other records as someone thorough to the point of obsessive about documenting even minor passages in exhausting detail. That single unexplained gap in an otherwise meticulous record had bothered me for weeks before we ever went underground. My team of 4 reached that marked passage on our second day underground, a tight crawl that opened into a chamber none of us had any record of. And the moment we entered that chamber, our team's mood shifted collectively and immediately, all 4 of us feeling a wrongness we hadn't discussed beforehand, but all clearly experienced at once. Something our most experienced member later described as the cave itself holding its breath around us. Deeper in that chamber, our lights caught markings on the walls, deliberate markings, not natural mineral formation, and not anything matching known indigenous petroglyphs from the region that any of us recognized. Symbols repeated in clusters that seemed to spiral inward toward a smaller opening at the chamber's far end, an opening that our airflow instruments indicated led to a significant continuing void based on the draft coming through it, meaning more cave, undiscovered and unmapped, waited beyond. We never reached that opening because, as we approached it, all 4 of our lights, independently powered, freshly charged, dimmed simultaneously to almost nothing over the course of about 10 seconds. Not flickering, just steadily dimming like something was drawing the light itself out of the chamber. And in that near darkness we heard, from beyond the small opening, a low, sustained tone that none of us could identify as any known cave sound. Not water, not airflow, not settling rock. A tone that seemed to modulate slightly, as though it were responding to our presence, rather than simply existing independent of us. It rose in pitch very slightly each time one of us shifted our weight or spoke, as though it were listening for exactly that, cataloging each small sound we made, the way a predator learns the specific rhythms of prey it intends to take its time with. We retreated as a team, calm and disciplined, the way our training demands, even in genuine fear, moving back through the crawl in careful order with our most experienced member taking rear position without anyone needing to ask him to. And none of us spoke a single word until we were fully back in the main passage, with daylight visible somewhere far ahead. Our lights returned to full brightness the moment we were back in the tight crawl leading out of that chamber as suddenly as they dimmed. None of us have gone back, and when I later mentioned the incident carefully to an older caver from a different grotto club, he told me without much surprise that his own team had turned back from that same passage decades earlier after two of his members reported hearing their names spoken from beyond that same small opening, in voices matching people they'd lost years before, who had no connection to that cave whatsoever. Our club still discusses that survey occasionally at meetings, always carefully, always with a kind of unspoken agreement not to speculate too far beyond what we actually experienced, because every one of us understands that pushing the conversation further would mean eventually someone proposing we go back and finish the job properly. And none of us, even the most experienced among us, who has caved for over 30 years without ever once turning back from a passage, has been willing to raise that idea out loud. One of our newer members, who wasn't on the team that day and has only heard the story secondhand, asked recently at a meeting why we don't simply report the passage to a university geology department and let professionals with proper funding and equipment investigate it further. The silence that followed that question lasted long enough to answer it more completely than any of us wanted to, and eventually our most experienced member just said, quietly, that some passages are better left as a line on an old map that says unexplored, because the alternative is finding out exactly why 3 separate generations of cavers already made that same choice before us. The landowner has since asked our club not to attempt that passage again, and we've honored that request, in part because we respect him, and in part because none of us particularly want to find out what's on the other side of that opening after all. Caving requires a level of trust in the unknown that most hobbies don't demand, and I think that's part of why this hit our team as hard as it did. Caving has always demanded a certain comfort with the unknown, an acceptance that you will never fully map every passage or explain every strange draft or unexpected sound, and most of the time that acceptance is easy, even pleasant, part of what draws people to the hobby in the first place. What happened in that chamber tested the outer edge of that comfort in a way nothing in 20 years of caving had prepared me for. And I don't think any of us on that team will ever fully cave the same way again. We are officially halfway through tonight's stories, and if you've made it this far, you deserve to know that the back half gets worse, not better. If this channel has become part of your regular routine, prove it right now by liking this video, dropping a comment about which story has stuck with you the hardest so far, and making sure you're subscribed so the next batch of these lands directly in front of you the moment we post it. 5 more stories are waiting, and story 11 starts with something as simple as a knock on a door. Story 11. Old farmhouses carry the habits of the people who lived in them for generations. Small architectural choices that seem eccentric until you learn the reason behind them. And reasons like that rarely get written down anywhere for an appraiser to find in advance. Most of the time, those quirks stay quirks. In one particular house tucked into the Blue Ridge foothills, a simple detail in the hardware told me something was different before I ever heard a single sound. I work as an estate sale appraiser and antique dealer across rural Virginia and North Carolina, which means a significant part of my job involves entering homes that have often sat empty for extended periods after an owner's death. Sometimes homes that have been in a single family for well over a century, tucked away on properties far enough from any town that neighbors are more concept than reality. Estate work like mine means constantly walking into the aftermath of a life you never knew, piecing together someone's habits and priorities purely from the objects they left behind. And most of the time, that process feels almost tender, a final act of attention paid to someone who can no longer speak for themselves. That particular assignment felt different from the moment I pulled up the long gravel drive, though I couldn't have told you exactly why until I was well inside the house. I was called out to appraise the contents of a farmhouse in a remote part of the Blue Ridge foothills, a property whose last resident had lived alone for decades after her husband and children had all either passed or moved away, and whose distant relatives inheriting the estate wanted a full appraisal before deciding what to keep, sell, or discard. I arrived alone, as I usually do for initial walkthroughs, in the early afternoon with plenty of daylight left, expecting nothing more eventful than dust and outdated furniture. The house itself felt ordinary enough on the ground floor, cluttered in the specific way homes get when someone lives alone for a long time and stops throwing things away. But the moment I climbed the stairs to the second floor, I noticed every single door up there had been fitted with a simple exterior latch, the kind you'd use to secure a shed or a gate, mounted on the hallway side rather than inside each room, meaning the rooms could only be locked from outside, not from within, which struck me immediately as an unusual and slightly unsettling choice for a private residence. Appraisal work trains you to notice hardware most people would walk right past: hinge styles, lock mechanisms, the particular wear pattern a door develops depending on which side gets used more. And those exterior latches were the kind of detail that would normally just go into my notes as an oddity worth mentioning to the family. Nothing more. The sort of thing old farmhouses sometimes have, for reasons lost to time. It was only once I was alone up there with the light fading that the detail stopped feeling quaint and started feeling deliberate. I worked through the afternoon cataloging furniture and personal effects. And as the light started fading, I found myself in what had clearly been a child's bedroom decades ago, based on faded wallpaper and an old iron bed frame. And while examining a dresser, I heard very distinctly a soft, patient knocking coming from inside the room's closet. 3 knocks, evenly spaced, followed by silence, followed by 3 more knocks when I didn't respond. Old houses settle and make noise, and I told myself that firmly while I stood there. But the knocking had a rhythm too deliberate and too consistent to easily explain as settling, a patience to it, almost polite, like something waiting to be let in, rather than something trying to force its way out. And it continued at regular intervals for almost a full minute, while I stood frozen with my clipboard still in hand. When I finally worked up the nerve to check the closet, expecting perhaps a trapped animal, I found it entirely empty except for old clothing, with no gap or opening large enough for anything to have entered from outside. And the knocking upon my opening the door stopped immediately and did not resume for the rest of my visit. What I noticed only after I'd shut the closet again, standing there with my pulse still hammering, was that the old clothing hanging inside had been pushed neatly to both sides, leaving a clear space in the center exactly wide enough for someone small to stand, a detail I have never been able to explain and have never fully stopped thinking about. I mentioned the exterior latches and the knocking to the family member who'd hired me carefully, framing it as a professional observation about the house's unusual hardware, and she went quiet for a long moment before telling me that her aunt, the deceased owner, had mentioned more than once over the years that the upstairs rooms needed to be secured from outside because, in her words, whatever occasionally visited that closet needed to be kept contained to one room rather than allowed to wander the whole house, a statement the family had always dismissed as the eccentricity of an old woman living alone too long until now. I found myself, days later, unable to stop thinking about the specific phrasing the family member had used, that whatever visited needed to be kept contained to one room rather than allowed to wander the whole house, a choice of words that implied an ongoing arrangement rather than a single incident long past, something maintained deliberately across the aunt's entire adult life, rather than a single frightening event she'd simply never gotten over. It made me wonder how many other old houses I'd walked through over the years carried some version of the same quiet arrangement, hardware installed generations ago, for reasons nobody living bothers to explain anymore because the explaining was never really the point, only the compliance. I completed the appraisal, but I made sure never to be alone on that second floor again for the remainder of the job, and I have declined every subsequent request from that family to return to the property for follow-up work, citing scheduling conflicts that were not entirely true. A colleague of mine in the same trade, hearing me describe the latches secondhand over drinks one evening, went quiet and admitted she'd cataloged a nearly identical setup in a different county 2 years earlier. Same style of exterior latch, same era of house, and that she'd found tucked in a drawer in that home's sealed room a small ledger written in a careful hand recording dates and brief notes she hadn't wanted to read closely enough to understand. Neither of us has ever gone looking for a pattern beyond that, mostly because neither of us wants to know how many houses out here are keeping the exact same kind of quiet. That family did eventually sell the farmhouse to a young couple from out of state who had no idea about its history. And I've thought more than once about whether I have any obligation to say something, to warn them the way I wish someone had warned that aunt's own family generations back. I've decided against it every time, partly out of professional discretion and partly because I genuinely don't know what I would even say that wouldn't sound like the ravings of someone who spent too long alone in an old house one fading afternoon. Some houses hold on to arrangements made by people long gone, and I've learned in this line of work that it's better to respect those arrangements than to question them. Appraisal work has a way of making you feel like a temporary guest inside someone else's entire life story, walking through decades of decisions and habits, compressed into furniture and hardware and half-emptied drawers. And most of the time that feeling is bittersweet rather than frightening. That particular house reminded me that some of those decisions were made out of genuine necessity rather than simple habit, and that the difference between the two isn't always something an outsider can tell at a glance. If you've ever found something in an old house that made you understand a strange choice the previous owner made, even if you never got the full explanation, we want to hear it in the comments below. Like this video if that knocking rhythm is going to keep you up tonight, and subscribe, because Story 12 happens to someone whose entire job is protecting other people, and even that wasn't enough. Story 12. Firefighting in a volunteer department teaches you to read danger fast, because the margin between a controlled situation and a genuine emergency can collapse in seconds on an active wildland scene. What I want to tell you about isn't the fire itself, which we handled the way we handle every fire, but something that showed up at the edge of it that no training could have prepared me for. I'm a volunteer firefighter in a small rural department covering a mountainous stretch of southern West Virginia. The kind of department where most of us hold regular day jobs and answer calls on pagers whenever something comes in, day or night, rain or snow. Rural fire response out here often means wildland fires on isolated ridgelines, brush fires that can spread fast through dry timber with almost no immediate water access beyond what our tankers can haul in. Volunteering for a department like ours means training constantly for scenarios you hope you'll never actually face. Live burns, extraction drills, wildland certification courses that take up entire weekends every year. And after nearly a decade of that training, I genuinely believed there wasn't much a fire scene could show me that would catch me fully off guard anymore. That particular ridge taught me how wrong that confidence had been. We got paged out late one summer night for a reported brush fire on a remote ridge that our department rarely gets called to. Sparse enough on structures that we typically let controlled burns like that go unless conditions are dangerously dry, which that particular night they were. My engine was second on scene, and by the time we arrived, the fire had grown larger than the initial report suggested, forcing our crew to split into two groups, working opposite flanks to try to contain it, before it reached a stand of timber that would have let it run freely towards several structures further down the ridge. Wildland calls out here tend to follow a familiar shape once you've run enough of them. The same radio chatter, the same division of labor between crews, the same low hum of adrenaline that settles into routine after the first 10 minutes on scene. And it was precisely because that night had followed that same familiar shape right up until it didn't, that the shift felt so wrong once it finally came, like a song skipping a beat you didn't know you were listening for. I was assigned to the flank furthest from the road, working alone with a hand tool cutting fire break, while the rest of my group worked a section closer to our engine. Standard practice for a fire that size, with limited personnel. About 40 minutes into that work, with the fire's glow providing enough light to see by even without my headlamp, I became aware of a figure standing just beyond the edge of the burn, watching the fire, with what struck me immediately as an unnatural stillness, given the chaos and heat radiating from that close enough that I myself was sweating heavily just from proximity. I called out, and assuming it was a landowner or a curious neighbor who'd wandered too close to an active fire scene, which happens more often than you'd think in rural areas, and the figure didn't respond or move at all, simply continued watching the flames with a fixed attention that had nothing appropriate or human about its posture, arms hanging slightly too long at its sides, head angled toward the fire at a tilt that held steady even as I continued approaching to what I judged a safe communication distance. When I got close enough that the firelight should have clearly illuminated its face, I found instead that the light seemed to simply fail to land on it properly, the way a shadow refuses to lift even in direct sun, a wrongness that made my stomach drop harder than the heat or the smoke had managed to all night. And in that same moment, the figure turned its head toward me, slow and total, its whole upper body rotating with it, rather than just the neck. The fire's roar seemed to drop away entirely in that instant, replaced by a ringing quiet that had no business existing 30 feet from an active burn, and I felt something close to what my department's older members call fireground panic, a specific fear response some firefighters develop after enough exposure to genuinely dangerous conditions, except this had nothing to do with the fire itself. I retreated toward my crew without maintaining eye contact, radioing that I'd encountered an unauthorized civilian near the fire line, which was technically true even if incomplete, and by the time backup reached my position minutes later, the figure was gone without a trace. No path through the brush, no sign it had ever been there beyond my own account, and the unshakable feeling among two other crew members who arrived that something had very recently occupied that spot, despite the total absence of physical evidence. One of the two crew members who arrived just after the figure vanished told me privately weeks later, away from the rest of the department, that he'd felt something brush past him on the fire line that night that had nothing to do with wind or heat, a cold pressure moving through the smoke in a straight, deliberate line toward where I'd been standing, and that he'd never mentioned it to anyone else because he assumed nobody would believe a grown man talking about something like that on an active fire scene. Hearing him describe it independently, without my having told him any specifics beforehand, confirmed something for both of us that neither of us had wanted confirmed. We contained that fire before it reached the timber stand, and I never mentioned the full details of what I'd seen in my official incident report because there was no way to phrase it that wouldn't get me pulled from wildland response duty pending a psychological evaluation. And I need this volunteer position for reasons beyond just community service. Our chief, a man who's run this department for almost 30 years and isn't prone to exaggeration or superstition of any kind, mentioned to me privately a few weeks later, without my having brought the subject up first, that he'd had two other members over the years describe almost the exact same figure on fire scenes in that same general area, always at night, always watching rather than fleeing, and that he'd simply stopped assigning solo flank positions on any fire in that particular section of the county since, quietly adjusting staffing without ever formally explaining why to the rest of the department. I still respond to every page my department sends out, but I have never again taken an assignment on the far flank of a fire without at least one other person alongside me, regardless of what the incident commander says about available personnel. I've since learned informally and mostly through careful conversation over the years that our chief actually keeps a private, unofficial map marked with the handful of locations across the county where similar figures have been reported by crew members going back decades, a map that exists nowhere in any official department file and gets passed along quietly from chief to chief whenever leadership changes hands. He showed it to me once, briefly after I'd proven I could be trusted with it, and the ridge where I had my own encounter was already marked before I ever said a word about what happened to me that night. Volunteer fire departments run on a specific kind of trust between members, the knowledge that everyone on scene will do their job and back each other up, no matter what the situation demands. And that trust extends, it turns out, even to the things nobody wants to admit they've seen. Finding out my chief had quietly been tracking sightings like mine for years, without ever making it official policy, told me our department understood something important that never needed a training manual to be taken seriously. There's something about seeing your own fear reflected back at you by colleagues who witnessed the aftermath without seeing the cause that makes an experience like this almost harder to carry than if you'd been alone the whole time. Comment below if you've ever had other people validate that something happened, even though they didn't see the full thing themselves. Like this video and subscribe now, because Story 13 is the one our editor asked us to double check with the original submitter twice before we agreed to post it. So, Story 13. Ministry in these mountains means learning to respect traditions that predate anything written in Scripture. Community understandings that operate quietly alongside faith rather than in place of it. I've served small congregations across eastern Kentucky for 20 years. And one particular church taught me that some of those old understandings exist because the alternative was once tested and failed at a terrible cost. I work as a traveling minister covering a circuit of small rural churches across the mountains of eastern Kentucky. Several of them so small they can only afford a visiting preacher once or twice a month rather than a permanent pastor, which means I spend a considerable amount of time driving isolated roads late at night after evening services to reach the small parsonage cabin where I stay between circuit stops. Circuit ministry means building relationships with several congregations at once, rather than settling permanently into any single community. In over 20 years, I've come to love the particular character each small church develops, shaped as much by its landscape and its history as by any doctrine I bring with me. That one hollow church, though, always felt different from the moment I first arrived. A kind of watchfulness in the congregation that took me years to fully understand. One particular church on my circuit sits at the end of a hollow so remote that even longtime residents of the area speak of it carefully. And the congregation there, though small, has always been devout and welcoming, with one unusual tradition I noticed my very first visit and have observed every visit since, which is that every single member leaves before full dark, regardless of how the service runs. No exceptions. Even for events like potlucks or fellowship gatherings that at every other church on my circuit would run well into the evening. I asked the church's oldest deacon about this practice on my third visit, gently, and he told me, in the plain and unbothered way mountain people often deliver serious information, that the hollow had an understanding with something that predated the church itself by a very long time, an arrangement his grandfather's generation had struck to keep the community safe, the terms of which amounted simply to everyone being off that stretch of road and behind a closed door by full dark, no exceptions, and that the church itself honored that arrangement out of respect for the community, regardless of what any individual believed about it theologically. I've served enough small mountain churches over the years to recognize when a congregation shares an understanding they simply don't discuss openly, a kind of collective agreement that operates underneath the normal business of faith. And this particular church wore that quality more plainly than any other stop on my circuit, visible in small ways. The way certain families always sat nearest the door, the way even the liveliest fellowship gatherings had a natural, unhurried momentum toward wrapping up well before the lights started to fail. I didn't fully understand the weight of what he'd told me until an evening service ran unexpectedly long due to an emotional testimony from a congregation member, pushing our dismissal past dark for what the deacon later told me was the first time in over a decade And as I drove the 2 miles from the church to my parsonage cabin, along that single narrow road, my headlights caught something standing directly in the center of the road ahead. Tall and unnaturally thin, positioned with what felt like clear, deliberate intent, rather than any animal's incidental presence. I stopped my car well short of it, and it did not move, and I did not have anywhere to turn around on that narrow stretch, and for several long minutes, I sat there with my hands locked on the wheel, watching the way my headlights seemed to travel around its edges rather than fully settling on it. Praying in a way I don't think I've prayed with such raw and specific fear, even during genuine personal crises in my life. At one point, it tilted its head very slightly towards the church behind me, as though acknowledging exactly where I'd come from and exactly what I represented. And the figure simply stood there, facing my headlights, without any indication of intent to move aside or approach, as though it were waiting for something from me that I didn't understand how to give. I finally put my car in reverse and backed the entire 2 miles to the church rather than risk driving past that figure. And I called the deacon from the church's landline, and he arrived within 15 minutes along with 2 other church members, all of them moving with a calm efficiency that told me clearly this was not the first time this exact situation had occurred. They walked me to my car themselves, positioned between me and the road ahead, and escorted me the entire way to my parsonage on foot, alongside my slowly moving vehicle, not speaking, watching the tree line the whole way, and the figure did not reappear. The deacon told me afterwards simply that the arrangement exists precisely because it works, and that the one time in his memory it had truly broken down, decades earlier before the current understanding was established. The community had lost 2 young men on that very road under circumstances the older generation still won't discuss in detail, even among themselves. I asked the deacon some weeks later over coffee at his kitchen table whether the arrangement had ever been formally discussed with anyone outside the community, a county official or another church leader perhaps, and he laughed, without much humor in it, and said that arrangements like that don't get written down or reported anywhere, because the moment you try to explain it to someone who hasn't lived alongside it, you either sound insane or you invite exactly the kind of attention that upsets a balance that's held steady for generations. He told me plenty of hollows around these mountains have their own version of the same understanding, different terms, different histories, but the same basic shape, and that outsiders are better off never learning which hollows those are. I have never once allowed a service at that church to run past dark since, regardless of how meaningful the testimony being shared might be, and the congregation has never once complained about being cut short. I've been assigned to other churches on my circuit since, some in hollows every bit as remote as that one, and I've started paying much closer attention to the small unspoken rhythms each congregation follows without discussion, the way certain families cluster near exits, the way fellowship always seems to wrap itself up naturally well before dusk, regardless of how good the conversation is. I no longer assume those patterns are simply about getting home in time for chores or supper. I suspect now that I'm reading the visible edge of arrangements I'll never be told about directly, and I've come to respect that silence rather than push against it. Ministry teaches you to hold 2 things at once: deep faith and deep respect for the practical wisdom communities build up over generations, even when that wisdom doesn't fit neatly into any doctrine you were trained on. That deacon never once suggested his community's arrangement conflicted with their faith. And after that night on the road, I understood exactly why he saw no contradiction there at all. Faith and fear exist closer together in these mountains than most people expect. And that deacon's calm certainty about an arrangement none of us fully understand has stayed with me longer than almost anything else in 20 years of ministry. If your community has any tradition or rule that everyone quietly follows without ever fully discussing why, we want to hear about it below. Like this video, comment, and subscribe. Because Story 14 is about someone who broke a rule almost exactly like this one, and didn't have a church full of people ready to walk her home. Story 14. Rural mail routes teach you the specific quirks of every household you serve, standing instructions that most carriers simply follow without question, because arguing with an elderly customer's preferences has never once been worth the trouble. One instruction on my route, though, turned out to matter far more than any of the others, and I only fully understood why the one time I broke it. I work as a rural mail carrier on a contract route through a remote section of the North Carolina mountains, delivering to box numbers spread across nearly 90 miles of winding roads, many of them serving only a single household at the end of a long private drive. It's solitary work, almost by definition, and over the 11 years I've held this route, I've come to know its rhythms and quirks better than almost anyone besides the people who actually live along it. Contract mail routes out here get passed down or bid on rarely, since the isolation and long hours discourage most applicants, which means carriers who take these routes tend to stay on them for years, building the same kind of quiet familiarity with their customers that a small-town doctor might build over a career. I inherited that particular elderly man's box from the carrier before me, who mentioned the standing instruction about his drive almost as an afterthought during our single handoff conversation, without elaborating any further than the instruction itself. There's one household on my route, an elderly man living alone at the very end of an unusually long gravel drive, who years ago gave me very specific standing instructions, delivered calmly and directly the first week I took over the route, to never, under any circumstances, walk down to his actual house to deliver a package, and to instead always leave anything too large for his roadside box directly at the road, and honk twice before driving on, regardless of weather or package size, or how inconvenient that made things for either of us. I followed that instruction without incident for years, largely because most rural carriers develop a healthy respect for whatever specific requests longtime customers make, having learned that those requests almost always come from lived experience rather than mere eccentricity. About a year and a half ago, during an especially heavy snowstorm, I received an oversized package for him that I judged, in my own admittedly poor judgment that day, would blow away or get buried at the roadside before he could retrieve it, and I made the decision, against his standing instruction, to drive it down to his actual porch myself. Rural routes teach a carrier which instructions to take seriously without question, and his had always struck me as some of the most seriously delivered I'd encountered in 11 years on this job. Not fearful exactly, but weighted. The way a man talks about something he has made peace with only by never testing its limits. I'd honored it without complaint through blistering summers and iced over winters alike, always assuming the day would never come where following it seemed genuinely impractical. The drive was longer than I expected, winding through dense trees that blocked most of the remaining daylight, even though it was still officially afternoon. And about halfway down, I began to feel a specific and mounting wrongness that I can only compare to the sensation of walking into a room where an argument has just happened, a pressure in the air that had no obvious source. When his house finally came into view, I saw him standing on his porch already, not surprised to see my vehicle, but with an expression of genuine and immediate alarm that I will never forget, waving both arms urgently for me to turn around rather than continue toward the house. I stopped my vehicle roughly where he was gesturing, well short of the house itself, and he shouted at me, with more urgency than I'd ever heard from him in years of brief roadside pleasantries, to reverse immediately and not look toward the tree line on my left under any circumstances, his voice carrying a specific edge of panic that made the falling snow itself feel suddenly less threatening than whatever he was reacting to. I did exactly as he said, reversing that long drive faster than was probably safe on snow and gravel, and only glanced toward that tree line once for less than a second, catching a glimpse of something pale and still positioned among the trunks in a way that made my stomach turn cold, in a manner entirely separate from the weather. In that single glance, it seemed to me that whatever stood there had been positioned facing the house all along, patient in a way that suggested it had been waiting there long before my truck ever turned down that drive, and that my arrival had simply given it something new to consider. He caught up to me on foot at the road minutes later, having apparently taken a shorter route through the woods himself, moving with a speed I wouldn't have expected from a man his age. And once we were both safely at the roadside, he explained, breathing hard, that the tree line along that drive had a long and specific history on his property, one his own father had warned him about when he inherited the land decades earlier, and that the arrangement he'd maintained his entire adult life involved never allowing anyone, including delivery drivers, to approach the house directly, because whatever occupied that tree line had, over the years, come to associate vehicles approaching the house with an opportunity it did not otherwise have. He told me one more detail that day at the roadside, almost as an afterthought, before we both went our separate ways, that his father had lost a hired hand on that same property back when he was a boy, a young man who'd gone out toward that tree line one evening against explicit instruction and simply never come back. No body ever found despite an extensive search of the surrounding woods, and that his father had spent the rest of his life afterward treating that tree line the way you'd treat a live wire, with total unwavering respect and zero curiosity about what exactly made it dangerous. I have never once deviated from his instructions again, snowstorm or otherwise, and he has thanked me more than once, quietly, for trusting him that day. Even though I broke his rule to begin with, I still deliver to his roadside box twice a week, honk twice, and drive on without ever glancing toward that tree line, and I intend to keep doing exactly that for as long as I hold this route. He's gotten older and frailer since that winter, and I've started to worry, quietly, about what happens to that arrangement once he's no longer there to maintain it himself, whether a future resident of that property will ever be told the same rule with the same seriousness, or whether it'll simply fade the way a lot of old mountain knowledge eventually fades once the person carrying it passes on. I've thought about writing it all down somewhere, a kind of informal record for whoever inherits that house, but every time I sit down to actually do it, I find I can't put into words anything that wouldn't sound like the ramblings of someone who's spent too many winters driving alone on quiet roads. Rural delivery work puts you in a strange position of trust with people you technically barely know, seeing them only for seconds at a time across years of routine stops, and yet somehow absorbing enough about their lives to understand exactly when something has genuinely frightened them, versus when they're simply having an ordinary bad day. That man's fear was the realest thing I've ever witnessed in 11 years on this route, and it changed how seriously I take every standing instruction anyone on my route has ever given me since. That specific mix of genuine terror and immediate gratitude in his voice, once I was safely back at the road, is something I don't think I'll ever fully shake, and it taught me more about respecting an unexplained instruction than anything else in my career. If you've ever broken a rule someone gave you for reasons you didn't understand and immediately regretted it, tell us about it in the comments. Like this video and subscribe, because our final story tonight is the one we almost didn't post at all, and once you hear it, you'll understand why. Story 15. Wildlife rehabilitation puts you on isolated roads at every hour of the night, chasing reports of injured animals from people you've never met, trusting almost by default that anyone calling about a hurt creature at midnight means exactly what they say. That baseline trust had never once failed me in 8 years of this work, until one call taught me that something out there had learned exactly how to exploit it. I work as a wildlife rehabilitator out of a small licensed facility in the mountains of West Virginia, taking in injured and orphaned animals from across a wide rural service area, which means I frequently receive calls at odd hours from residents who found injured wildlife on their property and need guidance or pickup. It's meaningful work, though it puts me on isolated back roads at all hours, more often than most people would find comfortable. Licensed rehabilitators like me depend heavily on community trust to do this job well, since most of the animals we help only reach us because someone local cared enough to make a call in the first place. And I've always taken pride in being the kind of responder people feel comfortable reaching out to, regardless of the hour. That trust had never once been misplaced or exploited in 8 years of doing this work, which is precisely what made that particular midnight call so effective. About 8 months ago, I received a call close to midnight from a woman living alone at the end of a long dirt road, reporting what she described as a large owl caught in some fencing near her barn, distressed and unable to free itself, and asking if I could come out that night rather than wait until morning, given how badly the bird sounded like it was struggling. Owls are among the more common calls I get, and midnight pickups, while inconvenient, aren't unusual enough to give me pause, so I loaded my kit and drove out. Midnight calls about injured wildlife are common enough in this work that I keep a standing kit ready by the door specifically, so I never have to think twice about heading out. And in 8 years of doing this, I'd never once had reason to question whether a call was genuine, since people rarely bother faking concern for an animal at that hour if they don't actually mean it. That baseline trust is exactly what made the rest of that night work the way it did. Her property sat at the very end of a dirt road, bordered on both sides by dense forest that pressed close enough to nearly touch my vehicle's mirrors in places. And as I approached her barn on foot with my flashlight and carrier, I could indeed hear a sound consistent with the distressed bird, a repeated screeching call that matched, closely enough that I didn't question it at first, the general profile of a barred owl in distress, a sound I've heard genuinely dozens of times in this line of work and recognized instantly. What stopped me roughly 30 feet from the barn was noticing that the sound wasn't coming from any fixed point, the way a trapped animal's distress call always does, tethered as it is to wherever the animal is actually caught, but was instead moving steadily along the tree line paralleling my approach, matching my walking pace almost exactly, which is not something any trapped or injured animal, avian or otherwise, is physically capable of doing. I stopped walking entirely, and the sound stopped exactly when I did, and in the sudden silence that followed, I heard, from a different direction entirely, much closer to the barn itself, a low, chuckling laugh that had a specific and deliberate human quality to it, patient and amused, coming from somewhere in complete darkness, beyond the reach of my flashlight, immediately followed by the same owl distress call, starting up again from yet a third location, further into the woods, as though whatever was making these sounds was testing several directions at once to see which one would successfully draw me deeper into the trees. There was something almost playful in the timing of it, a rhythm to the way each sound picked up right as the last one faded, like a performer running through the same small set of tricks for an audience of one, patient enough to keep offering them for as long as it took me to finally take the bait. I did not go any closer to that barn. I retreated to my vehicle at a controlled but urgent pace, glancing back only once to see nothing at all where the sound had seemed to originate. No bird, no shape, no movement of any kind, in a spot where 3 different sounds had just converged from 3 different directions within seconds of each other. I called the homeowner's number from my cell rather than approaching the house, and when she answered, clearly having been asleep, with obvious confusion about why I was calling rather than already handling the bird, I understood in that instant that whoever or whatever had called me an hour earlier reporting an owl had not been her at all, despite the call coming through what my dispatch log confirmed was genuinely her listed phone number. She told me once I explained what had happened, in a voice that had gone very quiet and very careful, that her family had experienced something similar exactly once before, years earlier, involving a call reporting an injured animal that had gone out from her landline without her knowledge or consent while she slept, and that the previous responder, a different wildlife handler entirely, had never fully explained what happened to him that night, beyond refusing ever again to take late-night calls from her address under any circumstances. I've adopted the exact same policy since, And I have never told my licensing board the actual reason why, because I don't believe there's a way to phrase it that wouldn't end my ability to keep doing this work. I contacted her phone provider afterward, quietly, framing it as a concern about possible fraud on her account, and was told only that the call had indeed originated from her line at the exact timestamp I described, with no record of any forwarding, spoofing, or third-party access on the account, an answer that gave me no comfort at all, and only deepened the specific dread I'd been carrying since that night. I never followed up further because I understood by then that some answers cost more than the comfort of having them is worth. I still don't have any explanation for how that call was placed from her actual phone number without her knowledge, and I've decided I don't want one badly enough to go looking for it. What I do know is that something out there understands exactly which sounds will make someone like me walk willingly into dark woods alone, and understood it well enough to use my own professional instincts against me with real precision. That specific, targeted quality is what has stayed with me longer than almost anything else. More than the sound itself, more than the laugh, the understanding that whatever was out there had studied exactly how to draw someone like me in. I mentioned the incident carefully and in general terms to a wildlife biologist I've collaborated with professionally for years, and rather than dismiss it, she told me quietly that she'd heard similar accounts from at least 2 other rehabilitators working different counties, always the same basic shape, a midnight call about an animal in distress that turns out to have never actually been placed by the person it appeared to come from, always drawing the responder toward a wooded area rather than any exposed or open ground. Neither of us has any explanation for it that would hold up outside this conversation, and neither of us particularly wants to be the one who goes looking for one. Rescue work of any kind depends on a baseline compassion that most of us in this field carry without much thought and automatic willingness to go help something in distress the moment we hear about it. And I've come to understand that whatever called me out that night specifically understood and relied on exactly that instinct in a way that still unsettles me more than almost anything else I've encountered in these mountains. I don't know how to protect against something that uses your own good nature as the bait, except to stay a little more careful than I used to be, and to trust that carefulness, even when it costs me a genuine emergency I might otherwise have missed. That's 15 stories for tonight, and if you made it all the way to this one, you already know why we save the hardest accounts for last. This channel only keeps finding stories like this because people like you keep showing up for them. So before you close this video, take 10 seconds and like it, drop a comment telling us which story you'll be thinking about tonight, and make sure you're subscribed with notifications on, because we post new accounts every single week, and you do not want to find out what next week's submissions look like secondhand from someone else's comment section. Thank you for staying with us tonight. Lock your doors, and we'll see you in the next one.